Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, Deputy Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I want to welcome you to today's talk on how landlords are managing the COVID-19 rental crisis. I want to let you know that the next and last session of this semester's Housing Research Seminar will be 2 weeks from today on Friday, May 7th, when we will be speaking. The topic is multidimensional housing insecurity, a new approach to measuring, understanding, and addressing problems among renters. Giselle Routhier, the policy director at the Coalition for the Homeless, Inc., will be the speaker. This was actually her dissertation research. The moderator will be Jen Malinsky from the Joint Center, who was also on Giselle's committee. Today's speaker is Elijah de la Campa. Elijah is a senior research associate in economics and urban analytics at the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative. The initiative is part of the Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, which is co-sponsoring today's talk. Elijah will be presenting preliminary findings from a recent center-supported survey of landlords in a dozen US cities. This research, which will soon be published as a Joint Center working paper, has been carried out with support from the Housing Research Collaborative, an initiative that's brought together the Joint Center, the Urban Institute, the NYU Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy, and the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. Before Elijah starts, let me note a couple of things about today's session. First, closed captioning is available, and you'll see that on the menu on your screen if that's something that you would like to use. Second, you can use Zoom's Q&A feature to ask questions. We have turned off the chat function. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We'll often aggregate them, but I apologize in advance if we don't get to yours. We have a fairly large number of people here today and a relatively short amount of time. Third, we will be posting a video of today's talk, probably sometime next week. However, because this is still a work in progress, we won't be posting the slides until that paper is published. That means if you haven't done so already, you should sign up to receive the Joint Center's blog, which will announce when that paper is available. Elijah will write a short blog summarizing his findings. And finally, a word about today. Elijah will speak for a little bit more than a half an hour, and then we'll take questions for about a half an hour, and we will wrap up at about 1:15 p.m. Elijah, welcome. It's all yours.
Thanks so much, David. Let me share my screen quickly here. All right. So thank you all for joining me here this afternoon. Welcome. So my name is Elijah de la Campa. As David mentioned, I am a senior research associate with the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative. And I'm really excited to be talking to you all today about some survey work I've been doing at the initiative with support from the Joint Center here at Harvard on sort of the impact of COVID-19 on landlords' rental business, and in particular, how are landlords managing and responding to this crisis? So I'm going to be showing some preliminary evidence, as David mentioned, and that report will be out hopefully within the next couple months. So with that, going to get into it. So I probably don't need to do a ton of convincing with this audience here today that COVID-19 has had a really profound impact on the rental market. But I do like these two headlines as a joint pair here because they really make the point that it is a market that we're talking about. There's two sides to the market, right? On the one side, we have the renters who are struggling to make rental payments during the course of the pandemic. They're depleting their savings, ruining their credit, and they're amassing arrears, and what happens when all that rent becomes due. So clearly the renter side struggling. On the other side, we have the landlords who are not collecting as much in rental payment as they were prior to the pandemic, presumably, and they're struggling to stay afloat themselves, struggling to make their mortgage payments, make their property tax payments. And I think that if we really want to understand the full extent of this crisis, we ought to really be studying how actors on both sides of this market are faring. And I think that we're starting to amass some good evidence in terms of exactly how that's shaking out. And hopefully we'll be adding to that evidence here today, right? So on the tenant side of things, I think we have a pretty good sense now. The Joint Center recently released a paper showing that up to 20% of all renters were behind on rent as of January 2021, so at the start of this year. So, that's contributing to an arrears crisis that estimates, range pretty widely here, but from around 8 billion to upwards of $50 billion. So we're talking billions of dollars of rent arrears being amassed over the course of the pandemic. We also have a pretty good sense that the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of its impact on the rental market, has had a pretty disproportionate impact on minority, low-income, and middle-aged renters. And that, again, comes out of some great work at the Joint Center, also work at the Urban Institute that I've sort of outlined here. But it's worth pointing out that these are exactly the folks, minority and low-income renters in particular, who are already struggling to meet their rent, to make rent prior to the pandemic. We of course have a housing affordability crisis in this country, and low-income renters, Black renters, Hispanic renters, not jointly but separately, upwards of 50% of each of those groups of renters were paying 30% or more of their income on housing even prior to the pandemic. So with the pandemic disproportionately impacting these folks in terms of being out of work, it's not so much of a stretch to imagine that these folks have also had the pandemic has also disproportionately impacted these folks in terms of the rental market. Oops. So on the landlord side of things, I think that we have comparatively less evidence, but we are starting to amass that evidence, as I mentioned, and that's why we're all here this afternoon. So, I think sort of the best set of evidence that we had early on in the pandemic came from the National Multifamily Housing Council, where they stood up a rent payment tracker very early on in the pandemic that essentially showed monthly payment rates relative to the prior year for large professionally managed landlord organizations. And what they showed, and what they continue to show, is that rental payment rates indeed are down for these groups of landlords, but 2, 3, maybe 4 percentage points. But of course, it's worth keeping in mind that these landlords represent a very small slice of the market, right? They are sort of the large, again, professionally managed organizations. They're more likely to own newer buildings, larger buildings, buildings that charge more in rent. Of course, there is the other side of the market. 50% of all rental units in this country are owned by individual landlords. So sort of the small mom and pop landlords who own 1, 2, maybe 3 rental properties and manage a handful of rental units. And we are starting to see gain some evidence here that rental collection rates indeed are down for these groups of small landlords, and landlords of color in particular. And it seems like they're down more relative to these larger landlords. And some of this evidence comes out of a survey that Vincent Reyna and his team did, the Housing Initiative at Penn in Los Angeles, a survey of landlords there. And of course, all the great work that Urban Institute's doing with Avail with their small landlord surveys. But also, there is another set of evidence I think that we have here, and it's the work that I've been doing in Albany and Rochester. And I think it's worth talking about this in a little bit more detail, because it really does form the basis of the larger cross-site survey that I'll be discussing in depth today. So in June and October 2020, I launched a survey of small landlords in Albany and Rochester, New York. And the questions in the survey, again, sort of form the backbone for the research that I'll be discussing today. It's really, how has COVID impacted your rental business, particularly relative to the prior year? And how are you as a landlord responding and managing this crisis? So this survey was specifically targeted to owners of 3 or few rental properties. And the invites were sent out via email or text message to those who were on the city's rental dwelling registry and had contact information on that registry. So clearly some potential selection issues here that we'll talk again about a little bit more when we talk about the broader survey, but worth pointing out now. And as I mentioned, we launched 2 waves, one in June and one in October 2020. And what we found here is that, just to quickly go through these results, is that early on in the pandemic in June, rental non-payment was up across the city. So in each city, rental non-payment was up around 20% in all neighborhoods and all types of properties relative to the prior year. What we saw is, as the pandemic progressed, by October, non-payment had intensified in communities with relatively more residents of color, and it had actually started to improve in neighborhoods with relatively fewer residents of color. So there was still an increase in rental non-payment or rent arrears relative to 2020, but relative to June, rental payment rates were getting better in neighborhoods with fewer residents of color and getting worse in those with more. So sort of interesting sort of patterns emerging, as the pandemic has progressed. What we also found was that in terms of landlords' responses to arrears, our second sort of main bucket of interest is that their most common responses across the board were to put tenants on rental repayment plans and to defer maintenance. And this was, again, true just across a variety of neighborhoods and property types. What we also found, though, on the other hand, is that landlords were more likely to take certain actions, again, in neighborhoods, in communities of color. So in particular, they were twice as likely to evict tenants, small landlords, I should say. They were twice as likely to evict tenants in these neighborhoods, 3 times as likely to charge late rental fees, and over 50% of rental properties in neighborhoods with more residents of color experienced deferred maintenance at some point during the course of the pandemic, relative to around 30% in neighborhoods with fewer residents of color. So these interesting patterns emerging where landlords were indeed taking different responses according to different neighborhood composition. So that all really brings us to the cross-site landlord survey that we'll be talking about today. You know, coming out of the small landlord study, there was some just outstanding questions that we were interested in sort of examining in further detail. And I think the first main one is really unifying sort of the research on the larger landlords and the smaller landlords, right? We didn't have a good set of evidence from one unified survey, from one survey that asks the same set of questions and in a sort of uniform way to really get at this differential impact of the pandemic on small landlords versus the larger landlords. So that was the first thing that we were really interested in answering. The second thing, as you can see here, is increasing the geographic spread. Obviously, we launched in Rochester and Albany and our small landlord survey, and they indeed took part in our cross-site survey, but we also incorporated some additional rental markets into this analysis. So we have some additional cities from the East Coast, a tranche of cities from the Midwest, and then our one lone West Coast representative so far in San Jose. I should also mention that there are 3 additional cities that took part: Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and Chattanooga, but we're still sort of crunching the numbers there, and we will incorporate those results later. So, but just really looking across rental markets that we know have different compositions of renters and properties, and the pandemic has impacted them presumably differently. So just getting a better sense of that was another really sort of outstanding question that we wanted to sort of shed light on. So in terms of the study design and setting here, again, we launched the same set of questions, I should mention, very similar questions: impact on rental business, how are landlords responding? Once again, we targeted landlords on cities' rental dwelling registries. This was simply just the quickest way to reach out to landlords, and frankly is in many ways the greatest set of landlords that we could possibly reach in many cities. So we launched the survey kind of on a rolling basis between February and March. So the survey was open for about a month in each city. We actually just closed our final survey merely a few weeks ago. So yeah, we launched it just within these past couple months. So the methodology that I feel really kind of sets our survey apart from some of the other surveys that have cropped up is that not only do we ask landlords questions about their overall portfolio, but we also ask them questions about distinct rental properties in their portfolio. And the benefit of doing this is that it's very hard to identify in any given city the population of landlords, the universe of landlords, right? Landlords, many landlords in cities incorporate as limited liability corporations. They sort of, many identities are obscured, and it's hard to really get a sense of how many properties a given landlord owns, for instance, right? What is comparatively easier to assemble is the universe of rental properties, right? You can use a mixture of city administrative data, tax records to really identify which properties are indeed rental properties. And that's really precisely what we did with our city partners. We worked with them to gather that information, to identify the universe of rental properties. And in that way, we can begin to adjust our sample to be more reflective of the population of rental properties overall, instead of just our sample of survey respondents. So that's essentially exactly what we did. We created inverse probability weights for our sample using all of this administrative data, such as property age, property type, histories of code violations. So we created those weights to account for selection into the registries as well as non-response bias. And then ultimately we calibrated those weights so that our sample was reflective of the population level distribution on a set of key parameters, like types of properties within the city and overall sort of city demographics. So took our best steps to sort of address this selection bias issue in a way that some of the other surveys just haven't been able to do. And in terms of our sample itself, overall, we had 1,831 responses to our survey, representing 2,069 total rental properties. That was good for about an 8.5% response rate, which ranges from around 7 to 12% across our cities. And one thing I forgot that I would like to have mentioned, in terms of rental registry compliance, we do indeed see variation in registry compliance across the cities in our sample, ranging from a high of around 75% in Trenton to 2/3 in Rochester, Racine, and then around 35% say in Albany. So there is considerable variation there. Again, sort of underlying the importance of creating these weights and taking steps to address potential selection. So just quickly wanting to show you all what our sample actually looked like. What did the landlords and the rental properties in our sample, what do they look like? I don't want to go through this in super depth, but there are certain things I want to point out as they will be relevant to the presentation moving forward. In terms of the portfolio size of landlords in our sample, we see owns 1 to 5 rental units. 89.7% of the landlords in our sample own 1 to 5 rental units. So we're skewed much more towards the smaller end of the landlord spectrum, the more mom and pop end of the spectrum. The remainder of the landlords are split in our sample are split relatively evenly between those that own 6 to 10 rental units and those that own 11 plus. But again, we're skewed very much towards the smaller landlord end of the spectrum here. In terms of the properties themselves, again, we converted the responses to the property level. 69.2% of all the properties in our sample are 1 units, 24% 2 to 3, and the remainder 4+ units. And that, because we calibrated on these, that really reflects sort of the underlying distribution of property types in our combined analysis, in our combined set of cities. And the last thing that I wanted to highlight is that around 10% of our rental properties are Section 8 rental properties. So with that, I'm going to get into the first set of results. So what we see here is the share of rental properties in arrears by all of the cities in our sample. And there's a few things that I want to just set up here because they're going to be useful for all of the sort of tables that I present and figures that I present moving forward. So first off, I'm defining arrears in this table and all subsequent tables as rental properties being in arrears if they generated less than 90% of their rental revenue in a given year. The reason I'm using that 90% cutoff is that even in sort of the best of times, not all rental properties, in a given year are generating the full amount of rental revenue again in that year. And the National Multifamily Housing Council data bear that out. And similarly, Vincent's work with the Los Angeles survey, Vincent Reyna's work with the Los Angeles survey also sort of bears that out. So moving forward, when I say arrears, it's going to be less than 90% of rental revenue. The other thing to point out here is that I'm showing 2 years, and I'm going to show 2 years across all of these graphs, and it's the change from 2019 to 2020, with sort of the main assumption being that the main driver of this change is the pandemic, right? So 2019 we're going to show in dark gray in all of our graphs, and 2020 is going to be in light gray. So that's just going to be common across all of these figures. And then the last piece of setup here is, why are we looking at this? Again, we understand and recognize that these different rental markets are comprised of different people, of different structures, of different homes, and the pandemic has made its way across this country sort of differentially in terms of its timing. So just getting a sense of how it's differentially impacted these markets again is something that not many have been able to do on this scale in terms of these local markets. So we're really excited to be able to provide this evidence. So in terms of the findings here, there's 3 things that I also think are worth sort of pointing out. So number one, it's the geographic variation in arrearage rates at baseline, so in 2019. So I've done my best to try to group this chart according to geography, right? So we have San Jose, our West Coast city, on the leftmost portion of this graph, and then our East Coast cities, Albany, Rochester, Trenton, on the right, our Midwest obviously in the middle there. So if we look at our East Coast cities, Albany, Rochester, Trenton, and you can lump Akron in there. Akron looks a lot like some of these cities in many respects. What we see is that the baseline arrears rates in 2019 were actually significantly higher in the East Coast cities relative to the Midwest and West cities. So it's at about 20% essentially in 2019 for each of these cities, indicating that landlords in these cities struggling a little bit more relative to their peers to collect their full rental payments in 2019. In the Midwestern cities, the figures range at baseline from around 5% in Minneapolis to 9% in Racine. So there's this geographic variation in sort of baseline payment rates. The second thing to point out, though, however, is that we actually do observe a pretty proportional increase in arrearage from 2019 to 2020 across all of these cities, right? So the East Coast city, and it's around a 2 to 3-fold increase in arrears from 2019 to 2020, both for the East Coast cities and the Midwest cities. So Albany, for instance, 19% arrearage rate at baseline in 2019 goes up to 43% in 2020. In Racine, it goes from 9% in 2019 to 27% in 2020. So a 3-fold increase there. So actually pretty proportional increases, right? The third piece to point out here is San Jose does look a little bit different from the rest of these cities. They, again, are our sort of lone West Coast representative. So we have comparatively less data on why this might be the case. The one thing that I do want to just point out, though, is that our sample of landlords from San Jose does look slightly different, since they come from, most of them are from a rent stabilization registry. So in that regard, they're not necessarily sort of representative of all landlords in the city. We do take our best steps to adjust those results accordingly, so that they're reflective of a sample of properties that are sort of with lower rents overall. So all in all, there's some more work to be done in terms of digging into the San Jose result. But I will say that all of the results that I show throughout this presentation are actually robust to the inclusion or exclusion of San Jose from the analyses. So more digging in to do with San Jose, and certainly bringing Los Angeles into the sample will help a lot to understand what's going on with our West Coast cities. So we can also look at this table of rental properties in arrears by what I'm going to be calling deep arrears. And again, I'm going to be using this terminology throughout the presentation. So I define a property as being in deep arrears if it's generating less than 50% of its rental revenue in a given year, right? So essentially what we have here is a figure that looks very similar to the prior figure, right? There's some geographic variation in baseline deep arrearage rates, with East Coast cities exhibiting relatively higher rates, Midwestern cities exhibiting relatively lower. But again, we observe relatively proportional increases from 2019 to 2020 in deep arrearage rates within each of these cities. So in this instance, it's on the order of 3 to 4 times increases in deep arrearage rates from 2019 to 2020. So overall, we've seen that arrears and deep arrears have increased relatively proportionally within each of the cities in our sample. So with that, I would like to just move forward now to examining some of the heterogeneity in these arrearage rates according to landlord, property, and neighborhood characteristics in our combined sample, sort of knowing that the results have been relatively proportionate within each city. So some additional setup here, because we're going to again be seeing this graph several times. What I'm showing now is rental property arrearage by landlord portfolio size, right? So what we see in this set of figures is going to be 2 panels. On the left panel, we have what I've been referring to as general arrears, less than 90% of rent received. And on the right panel, we have what I've been referring to as deep arrears, which is less than 50% of rent received. And within each of these panels in this set of graphs, we're going to be looking at changes from 2019 to 2020 in rental payment rates by the indicated subgroups. So in this instance, it's by landlord size. And the subgroups that we're looking at in particular here are the smallest landlords, those who own 1 to 5 units, sort of a mid-range landlords who own 6 to 10 units, and 11 plus landlords and then the largest landlords who own 11 plus units. And again, it's around 90% small landlords in our sample, just to keep in mind, right? So what we see here, if we start, rather taking a step back, why are we interested again in doing this analysis in particular? So again, I think this is all about sort of unifying the results that we've seen for larger landlords and smaller landlords in these separate surveys, right? We certainly have reason to believe that smaller landlords, given some of the evidence that we've seen, have been more impacted in this pandemic relative to larger landlords, but we haven't been able to unify it in one common survey, right? So this is our sort of attempt to shed light on that issue. If we look at this leftmost panel, what we see here is something similar that we saw in the cities, with relatively similar baseline arrearage rates across the different landlord sizes, right? So it's at roughly 20% baseline arrears rates in 2019 for the different landlord buckets. By 2020, arrears increase across the board for landlords of each size. So small landlords, mid-sized, larger landlords, they all experience an increase in arrears. And once again, it's relatively proportional within each of these buckets. And so smaller landlords see about a doubling of arrears, as do the largest landlords. I think there is some slight evidence that the mid-sized landlords might experience a relatively larger increase in arrears, but the story here is that arrears in general have increased for large and small landlords alike, right? So that's sort of an across the board thing that we're finding here. When we look instead at deep arrears, we see a slightly different story, right? So if we start with the largest landlords, our 11 plus unit landlords right here, we see that from 2019 to 2020, there was essentially no change in deep arrearage for that group of landlords. So it's not the case that deep arrears have increased for the largest landlords. However, on the other hand, the smallest landlords and the mid-range landlords in particular have seen pretty large increases in deep arrearage, right? It's a 6 percentage point increase for those that own 1 to 5 units and a 17 percentage point for those who own 6 to 10. So again, pretty large increase in deep arrears for this group, not for the largest landlords. So what we're seeing is indeed, while arrears overall are increasing for landlords of all stripes, it does appear to be the case that the smaller landlords, the mid-sized landlords, are seeing more intense increases in arrears. And as a smaller landlord, as a mid-sized landlord, for you to have, even 1 or 2 properties in deep arrears, that is a larger proportion of your overall portfolio, right, relative to a larger landlord. So we really see how the pandemic has impacted just the viability of the business of smaller and mid-sized landlords in a way that it's not doing for the largest landlords, right? And these results actually align quite nicely with the survey results from Los Angeles put out by the Housing Initiative at Penn, where they found a similar pattern of general increases in arrears, but increases in deep arrears for the smallest landlords. So another interesting way to sort of cut the arrearage data is by looking at housing voucher status. And sort of some motivation for why this could be an interesting test is that, the effect here I think is actually pretty ambiguous, right? Because, properties that accept Section 8 housing vouchers or have tenants who use Section 8 housing vouchers, that's guaranteed income for those landlords, such that, we might think that it prevents arrears from piling up because you have some guaranteed rent that you can pay every single month, right? At the same time, folks who use Section 8 vouchers are most likely to be disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in terms of losing work, being out of work. So, it might actually be that even despite that fact, arrears are piling up for these individuals. So we can essentially just perform the same exercise for this subgroup. And on the left, we can again start by looking at general arrears. So we see here something very similar to what we saw for the small landlords, in that there does appear to be an increase in general arrears from 2019 to 2020, roughly about a doubling. And that doubling is consistent across properties that do not accept Section 8 vouchers and those that do accept Section 8 vouchers. So proportionate increases, and I should have mentioned on the previous slide, these differences are significant within virtually everything that I'm showing. These differences across years are indeed significant. So it appears to be the case that Section 8 is preventing people from getting into arrears in general, but if we look at deep arrears, again, what we see is Section 8 does appear to be preventing sort of the worst outcomes, the deep arrears. Again, no real difference in deep arrearage rates from 2019 to 2020 for rental properties that accept Section 8 vouchers. For the non-Section 8 properties, on the other hand, again, roughly a doubling of deep arrears from 2020 relative to 2019. So in this instance, it does appear that Section 8 is preventing the worst possible outcomes. And again, this research actually aligns quite nicely with some work done by Urban and Avail, where they found that smaller landlords who accepted Section 8 had sort of less arrears accumulating on average relative to those that didn't. So overall, I think building a nice body of evidence with this survey work in relation to some of the past surveys that have been done that don't necessarily combine all of these things into one, right? So One final way that I think is useful to sort of analyze the arrears data is by looking at a neighborhood's income, right? So we don't collect renter demographics in our survey simply because wouldn't really be possible. But we do collect exact address, as I mentioned, so we can actually match each rental property to its census block group, which is a relatively small geography, right? And what we can do then is classify census block groups according to whether or not the median income for that block group falls above or below the citywide median. So we perform this within each city in our sample. And again, we can then sort of examine arrears rates by essentially neighborhood income. And again, the idea here being that, we have a pretty good sense that low-income renters of color have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in many ways. So this is a useful subgroup to analyze. So what we see here is actually slightly different relative to the prior graphs. We do again observe an increase in general arrears from 2019 to 2020 in lower income neighborhoods and higher income neighborhoods. In this instance, it does appear to be the case that the increase in the lower income neighborhoods might actually be slightly higher than that in the higher income neighborhoods. Again, these differences across years statistically significant in each case. So it does appear that arrears are increasing overall by neighborhood type, but that increase might be slightly larger in the lower income neighborhoods. Again, moving on to a deep arrears analysis is when we see this pattern emerge even more, right? The lower income neighborhoods see a doubling of their deep arrears rate from 10% to 20% from 2019 to 2020, whereas in the above median income neighborhoods, there's essentially no change in the deep arrears rate due to the pandemic. So not only does it appear to be the case that the pandemic has disproportionately increased arrears overall in these lower income neighborhoods, it is certainly the case that it is disproportionately increasing deep arrears rates in these types of neighborhoods. So again, sort of conforming to the body of evidence that we have here in the pandemic's disproportionate impact on this segment of the market. So the last bit that I feel like I have some time to show today, hopefully I'm not going too quickly, is landlords' responses to arrears, right? And that's the sort of other big chunk of our survey work was how are landlords actually just managing and responding to this crisis? And what we're really excited to be able to show is, again, performing this analysis according to some of those interesting subgroups that we haven't been able to do before, the small landlord versus larger landlord, for example. So the reason for sort of doing this me choosing landlord size in particular right here is that I think we have good reason to believe that the actions that landlords take in response to the pandemic might really differ a lot across landlord type, right? Smaller landlords might be more likely to have closer relationships with their tenants, which might make them more likely to put them on payment plans or even grant rent reductions, less likely to evict them, say. So it's worthwhile to sort of test whether or not this is actually what we're seeing in the data, right? So what we see here is a graph of responses, which are listed on the y-axis. That's 9 responses overall there. And we're separating these out according to landlord size. So the smallest and mid-sized landlords we see in dark blue, and the largest landlords, those with 11 plus units, we see in this dark green color. So sort of just starting at the top and working our way down, what we see is that contrary to maybe what we would have thought, it is certainly not the case that small landlords are more likely to grant rent extensions or put tenants on rental repayment plans. In fact, nearly 90% of larger landlords have put tenants on payment plans or granted extensions compared to only 60%. Sorry, 90% of larger landlords' rental properties compared to 60% of smaller landlords' rental properties. And this is a difference that's significant at the 1% level. So really kind of going against what we might have thought here in terms of where this actually broke down. When we move on to rent reductions, again, does not appear to be the case that smaller landlords or mid-sized landlords are more apt to give rent reductions relative to larger landlords. It's roughly 20%, slightly less than 20% in each of these groups. Similarly, no real differences across landlord types in the implementation of rental fees at rental properties or increasing barriers to rent, which I define as increasing rents at a property or increasing tenant screening standards for that property. So on the other hand, decreasing barriers to renting properties, which includes the converse of that, right? So decreasing rents or lowering tenant screening standards, we see large differences once again across landlord type for this type of response. So nearly 50% of larger landlords' rental properties have experienced decreased barriers to rent compared to, again, just under 20% for smaller landlords' rental properties. Again, a result significant at the 1% level here. And I think that what really might be driving this result is that larger landlords we find in our survey are much more likely to have increased vacancy rates during the course of the pandemic, presumably due to the pandemic. I think around 55% of large landlords reported that in our sample compared to 15% for the smaller landlords. So certainly if you have more vacancy rates, you might be willing to take more actions to actually fill those vacancy rates faster, right? So I think that could be one thing that's sort of contributing to that result there. Moving down to evictions, we see, again, larger landlords, this one I think sort of breaking down maybe according to what our prior beliefs would have been, with larger landlords more likely to actually evict tenants during the course of the pandemic. These rates, relatively high for both groups of landlords. So, over 30%, around 30, close to 35% for the larger landlords, around 18% for the smaller landlords. Again, a difference that's significant, 10% level this time. And sort of one reason that this might be occurring here, there could be many, but one potential explanation, larger landlords much more familiar with evictions in general. So I think they're around 3 times as likely to have evicted tenants in the years prior to the pandemic relative to the smaller landlords. And then finally, just the two that I wish to highlight, missing payments and selling and listing properties for sale. These are actually actions that are much more common for the smaller landlords. And again, I think this is really sort of internally consistent with the results that we've been showing on arrears, right? So small landlords much more likely to have properties in deep arrears, right? So because of that, when the financial sort of stability of your property, of your portfolio rather, is in question, a greater share of your portfolio, specifically relative to the larger landlords, it could indeed be the case that you miss your mortgage payments, you miss your property tax payments, you simply can't keep up. The financial sort of viability of your whole business comes into question. And then similarly, the results for selling properties, again, if the financial viability of your business is in question, you might be more inclined to actually start to sell those properties relative to the larger landlords who can weather the storm a little bit better because deep arrears haven't seemed to be increasing at the same rate. And again, I think these last two results align quite nicely with some of the emerging work we're seeing from the Los Angeles survey and some of the urban and Avail surveys. So with that, to conclude and wrap everything up here. So what we've shown today is that relative to 2019, rent arrears, general rent arrears, have been up across a variety of rental markets, property types, landlord types and sizes, neighborhoods in 2020. So the pandemic has really caused an increase in general arrears just pretty much across the board, right? At the same time, it does seem to be the case that the pandemic has increased deep arrears for a subset of people, and in particular for particularly vulnerable groups like small landlords and renters in low-income communities. So it does appear to be the case that smaller landlords and renters in these lower income communities are sort of getting further and further in arrears as the pandemic seems to be progressing. And the one sort of bright spot that we've seen is that Section 8 housing vouchers do appear to have insulated landlords and tenants from the pandemic's worst effects. It does appear to have insulated sort of that deep arrearage from happening at those types of properties. We've also shown and seen that larger landlords are more likely to, stepping back in general, we've also seen that landlords' most common responses in general have been to put tenants on payment plans and extensions, deferred maintenance, which we didn't talk much about. But we also have seen that there are some differences in how landlords are responding. And we've seen that larger landlords are more likely to offer rental extensions and payment plans and decrease barriers to rent to sort of fill their vacancies, while smaller landlords have been more likely to miss their payment obligations and list properties for sale, right? And overall, I think that what we've tried to show here today is essentially, to tie it all together, just further evidence that the pandemic has really exacerbated some of the pre-existing inequalities that we've seen and known about for vulnerable renters and landlords alike. And it's precisely the renters in the most vulnerable communities and the small landlords that are most likely to house the renters in those communities that seem to be disproportionately impacted by deep arrears and have taken sort of proportionate measures to combat that crisis. So that's all I have for you all today. I'm looking forward to your questions, and thanks so much for your time.
Elijah, thank you. There's so much to dig into here. There were a bunch of questions, just to go back. I know you touched a little bit on this about just this, how you're dealing with selection bias given the pretty low response rate, and how confident, I guess, you are that you've got a reasonable shot at describing the full set of landlords.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it is certainly, I would say, just off the bat, we do our best. I'm not saying that this is perfect by any means. What we try to do here is really use the existing data that we have to sort of aid in sort of figuring out whether or not someone would have responded to the survey or in general been on a landlord rental registry, and then ultimately calibrate the weights that we have to make sure that at least on some key parameters, they do indeed reflect the population. So we're doing a two-step procedure here. It is a non-probability sample, and there are certainly issues with that. The best we can do is be transparent about the things we're doing and show that, I don't show it here, but after we've made our adjustments, our sample does look, certainly on our key variables, reflective of the population overall, and that's really the best that we can do. And I will point out again that the rental registry in some of these cities is really quite robust. We're talking upwards of 70% in a handful of these cities. So I do think that to an extent, it could be reflective of folks, and the non-response bias is an issue, and we just have to deal with that as any other survey would.
You answered, actually, I was going to ask you about how much we should trust the rental registries. There was a really interesting question about, and I think the data on the share of landlords that are going to evictions was striking, and I'm wondering whether there were eviction moratoria in place in some of your cities, and whether you saw any significant differences in behavior in places that had eviction moratoria.
So that's a great question, and is something, it's basically like the first analysis that I want to do after everything I've done today. It's certainly something that I think could be just a fruitful line of research. I will point out that Albany and Rochester, they did have eviction moratoria in place, for instance, for a big chunk of time, but it also lapsed. So really it's finding all of the laws were changing so rapidly. We really need to build a compendium of that to sort of figure out how long the moratorium were in place in each of these cities, and do as robust of analysis as we can. And I completely agree that that's something that we really want to do, I think, as soon as possible.
Elijah, in the Albany and Rochester work, which we published, I guess, about a month ago, is a joint center paper that I encourage people to look at. You also looked at the extent to which landlord behavior varied by neighborhood characteristics, and I'm wondering if you've had a chance to see whether that has applied in this work as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I can show that. I can do that. Yeah.
Yep.
Let's do that. So I do have that graph. It's hard to fit in everything that I wanted to show because there's so many interesting things. But yes, so I do show one. I show the sort of heterogeneity in landlords' responses to arrears by neighborhood median income in this graph. I will point out that it looks very similar when you break this down by neighborhood racial composition as well. And what we're seeing here is results that I think actually align quite nicely with the Albany and Rochester work, right? And in that work, we saw that landlords were more likely to evict tenants and defer maintenance in particular in neighborhoods with more residents of color, with lower incomes. And that, again, is sort of exactly what we're seeing here. Once again, landlords' most common responses to the pandemic when breaking things out this way: to defer maintenance, to put tenants on rental payment plans. And again, we're sort of seeing differences in some of those key outcomes, such as evictions and deferring maintenance here as well. And
you didn't show this by race, but I think you've indicated, I think you said it in the talk, you sort of said it when we chatted, that the income characteristics, also neighborhoods that have higher than median shares of people of color, also the graphs would look pretty similar?
Yes, correct. Yeah, it looks very similar. I have the arrears graph by residents of color, so you can see it's a very similar pattern, right? In neighborhoods with sort of a below median share of residents of color, smaller decreases in overall arrears, larger in the above median neighborhoods, and a similar pattern with the deep arrears as well. And that of course extends to the landlord responses. So very similar, unsurprisingly, given how correlated these things are. But yes, all of those results kind of are sort of aligning with what we've seen in the smaller survey as well.
Do you have a sense as to why tenants in the smaller properties, why those are much more likely to be in deep arrearage? Is it something about who's living in those properties, about how they're managed? What's the story we should tell about that data?
I think it's probably a combination of factors, but certainly one big one I think is who's living there, right? So at the smaller properties are more likely to be owned by small landlords. Small landlords are more likely to sort of provide naturally occurring affordable housing and house our nation's most vulnerable renters. So I think when you put that all together, you see that in these smaller properties, it's the most vulnerable renters, people that have been out of work for longer, have been disproportionately impacted from a health stance, from access to education, an array of dimensions, such that I think what we've shown today is really just another dimension in which they have been disproportionately impacted. The rental market in terms of arrears, and also generally how landlords are responding to that, and perhaps unwittingly sort of creating a vicious cycle of housing instability in these communities.
Now, you were fielding these surveys in February and March, so even if they were being fielded after the CARES Act had passed, the actual money probably hadn't flowed out yet. I don't know if there's anything from your data about what we might expect once both the direct payments go out, but all of the other ways that the CARES Act is putting money in the hands in the pockets of renters.
Yeah, so we ask some questions about anticipated future behaviors in the survey, which I haven't done that dove into that analysis a ton just yet. So I think that to the extent that landlords had been expecting money to come through, it might be reflective there. I will also note that, though, I think, again, just to shout out some of the people that are doing work in this space, in Vincent Reyna's Los Angeles survey, for instance, I believe that they show that in general, sort of knowledge of rental assistance programs is not as good as you might want it to be, right? So like, I'm not even sure that anticipation of CARES Act dollars coming down the pike might have impacted how folks responded on the survey overall. And particularly, I think there's probably differences in terms of expectations according to landlord size. And we see that, we are a little bit overrepresented on the smaller landlord end of the spectrum. So I don't have a ton of evidence about that, but I think looking at sort of future behaviors will be a good step in putting the puzzle together, probably.
But I just want to make sure I understand your research plan. I mean, your surveys are done, you're kind of in an analysis stage, or is there another one?
Oh, no, sorry. Yes, correct. Yeah, to clarify, I'm in the analysis stage.
Yeah.
It's really just a question about what do you expect to do as a landlord, not necessarily like, we're going to email you again and see what you did. So, yeah.
I guess I'm going to combine two kind of research questions. One is just somebody was asking why you made the cutoffs where you did, sort of the 1 to 10 and 11 plus respectively, and if we have a sense of the range of how big the 11 plus might be. Why don't we answer that, and then I'm going to get to more of a prospective question.
Sure. Yeah. So part of that was actually driven by the arrearage graph itself. So if we recall that graph, we saw that deep arrears were up substantially for both the smallest group, the 1 to 5, and then the 6 to 10 group as well. Whereas the 11 plus seemed a little bit seemed like there was not an increase in the deep arrears for that group. So that certainly explains the grouping in the landlord response graph. In terms of grouping them overall, it's really an artifact of the survey. We only have so fine of grained data on landlords' portfolio sizes, and we don't have, frankly, a ton of landlords who own a ton of units. So there are some that are up to as high as 200, 300 units in our sample, but overall, it's,
Mm.
the people at 11 plus, it's, in the 20 range, something like that, maybe 30, 40, 50.
And to be clear, there's a question about why you find what you're finding for arrearage is much higher, for example, than we see from the National Multifamily Housing Council's
Yep.
payment tracker. Is that a sort of a result of the fact that you're probably capturing more of the smaller landlords than they might?
Yeah, so certainly that's the case. I mean, it's a little bit complicated. So number one, I would say that, there's selection in, obviously, in both of our samples. The National Multifamily Housing Council, large professionally managed landlord organizations, they're basically, the tippy top of the market in terms of, people who could presumably pay their rent with regularity, I think. Even while we do have larger landlords in our sample, of course, but they are landlords who don't necessarily own that type of housing. I think I did a little bit of analysis into this, and even the larger landlords in our sample, the average age of their larger buildings is a little bit older. Those properties are in, not necessarily the highest income neighborhoods. So I think we're just getting a different slice. And a slice that's a little bit expanded, frankly, from the National Multifamily Housing Council. And I think probably, the true impact on larger landlords probably lies somewhere between what I'm finding and what they're finding, and hopefully my adjustments account for that as best as they can.
Wondering if you could talk about where the research is going, both in terms of what's left in terms of the cross-city analysis for this paper, and then what you would think of as kind of the open questions that you'd like to dig into, or do you think that this suggests for the next researcher to dig into?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So I think in terms of our analysis, cross-city analysis, we're certainly excited to get that extra data in there, right? We're just in terms of logistics, getting Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and Chattanooga into the analysis will I think be a great boon. Certainly to have another West Coast city in particular, it will help contextualize the San Jose results a little bit better, I think, as well. And sort of to answer the second part of that question a little bit too, getting Chattanooga, going to be great to have them in the analysis. What I would have loved to see is representation from more southern cities. I do think that's still to some degree an open question. It's a swath of the market that I think we know comparatively less about, and would certainly be worthwhile to invest in. That's merely just one sort of additional sort of cross-market analysis that one could do here that I think would be a fruitful avenue of research. And I think, frankly, just continuing to explore how landlords and renters alike are continuing to respond and evolve, frankly, because the pandemic is changing constantly. It's the responses to the pandemic at the federal level are changing. It's really an everyday changing affair. So it's just interesting and important, I think, and useful to document how over the course of the pandemic things have changed, responses have changed, people have adapted, people have evolved. So that was certainly one thing that we hope to do with this work, and I think, frankly, that would be useful for others to keep doing in the future as well.
Just a methodological question. It sounds like to do this work, you had to be partnering with the cities. And so my hunch is that there was something about that came out of the Bloomberg city relationship, so that it's not like you picked these cities completely at random, and that may explain, I guess, you couldn't find a southern city that could help you out in the same way.
Yeah, so definitely we were grateful and to be able to work with that Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Network. We've worked with tons of cities across the country. So certainly that was our introduction to many cities. I think we probably spoke with around 40 cities at first, something like that, to try to see if there was a project that we could work on. And so yes, they're not entirely random. I would say some of the other cities actually came through other random connections as well. But we had an intent to incorporate geographic variation. Like that was something that we wanted to do from the onset, and we did it as best we could given the constraints that we had. We reached out to some southern cities and were not as successful, but we're happy to have Chattanooga be part of the study.
And I mean, I would assume part of the cross-city analysis will also be looking at demographic and socioeconomic differences between those cities
Yeah.
to see if they explain some of
For
the
sure, yeah. And I've done a little bit of work, not as much as I would have liked to do, but a little bit of work about sort of the within each city, are we finding the same patterns? And I think that that's the case for some of our sort of subgroups, and not the case for others. So I think that the full paper will sort of bring this to light a little bit more, because I agree that's a really interesting open area of research as well.
An interesting methodological question got posed about whether you have any data on race and ethnicity of the landlords in your survey, and whether, if you do, if you've been able to map that against at least the neighborhood characteristics of where their properties
Yep.
are.
Absolutely, we do have that, and I haven't done that in the cross-site work yet, but I did for the small landlord survey in Albany and Rochester, and exactly as this question asker, I guess, is right, it probably is pointing out, the folks that are most likely to own homes in low income and neighborhoods with more residents of color are more likely to be people of color themselves. Precisely. So, it's really in that paper, I think what we find is this vicious cycle of small landlords who are more likely to be people of color being disproportionately impacted by arrears, and then, perhaps unwittingly taking responses that really serve to increase the housing instability in their communities for their renters, and then ultimately back for them as well as vulnerable landlords. So definitely we'll be doing more work to map that out in this survey as well.
And to be clear, we don't know the race of and ethnicity of their tenants. We only know
we don't know that. Correct.
Let me wrap up with a kind of a big question, which is, I mean, as you said, one of your really striking findings is that a lot of these small landlords are in fact thinking about selling, have fallen behind, and may be forced to sell. Should we be worried about a significant decline in the number of small local landlords? And I guess the related question is, we don't yet know who's buying, although we know some larger patterns in real estate. So what is this a big enough phenomenon that you think it'll make a major difference in kind of the housing ecosystems in these cities? And if so, what, if anything, might we be doing about it from a policy point of view?
Yeah.
Aren't you glad I saved that for last?
Yeah, no, I mean, that is really that's the question, right? And I think that, so to take the conservative answer, I think we need to just dig into the finding a little bit more. But to sort of take the a little bit less conservative answer, yes, I think we probably should be worried. This is something that worries me. Certainly, it appears to be the case that these smaller landlords, these more vulnerable landlords who own these types of properties have been more seriously impacted. A greater share of their business has been more seriously impacted. It cannot be the case that they can stay afloat forever, right? So I think that, in terms of the policy sort of potential solutions here, I think rental assistance is just a must. Getting dollars into the hands of these small landlords, all landlords who have been impacted by arrears, and particularly the smaller folks who, again, provide the naturally occurring affordable housing, who seem to be more in deep arrears. It's imperative to get money into their hands. And thankfully we have some packages sort of making their way down the pike, but I think that is just an imperative policy solution at this point. That's could be hopefully is one of our best bets. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, and we could go on for some time, but we did promise folks and are cognizant of Zoom fatigue. I want to thank you for a great presentation. I want to remind folks to be on the alert for a paper that will include some of the analyses that are still to be done, and some of the terrific work that's already to be done. If you're on the Joint Center's mailing list, you should hear about it. If you're not, you should be on the mailing list. Also, a reminder that 2 weeks from today, we'll wrap up the seminar series with a talk on measuring a new way to measure housing insecurity that brings together a couple of different measures. Elijah, I want to thank you for just, I think, a really important and fascinating and stimulating and in some ways worrying set of work. But this is really exciting. I'm really glad that the Joint Center has been able to work with you and the Ash Center, and I'm really thrilled that the COVID consortium that we're part of has been able to support this work, and I look forward to reading it. So you won't be able to hear us all applauding, but know that there's a lot of applause hands out there. Thank you very much for a terrific presentation.
Thank you all so much.
And thank you all for attending.